I'm what they call I used to call myself a meaty because, you know, I'm like, my mother is an Indigenous and my father is an American, but my father I never really knew. So I was raised Native. And I study at the university here in Val d'Or, and it's the Université du Québec de l'Abitibi-Temiscamingue, and I'm also a real bilingual, so I may go back from French to English too. So yeah, and as for, oh yeah, my studies, I'm in education at the moment, but before I started the education program about 2 years ago, I was in administration at the university in Val d'Or, and I switched because I realized that administration wasn't really what I wanted to do. Before that, I was an educator in a daycare for 16 years and had a daycare also at my place for 5 years. So I just wanted to, you know, go back with the children. So right now I'm doing one of my practicums at one of the English schools, well, the only English school they have here in Val d'Or. So I'm there at the moment.
Thank you, Donna. And I'll let Rachel introduce herself.
Yes, my name is Rachel Martin. I am Mi'kmaq from the community of Listuguj. However, I've lived most of my life in Montreal, or more specifically Brossard. My educational journey is a bit non-typical. After completing high school, I was in college for a little bit, but I was struggling majorly with anxiety. And so much so that I ended up dropping out. And I started taking some random jobs, which were not fun, but that was all that was offered to me, with someone with only a high school diploma, until I found a data entry job with the CRI Health Board. And from there, I basically worked my way up the hard way, from data entry to receptionist to secretary, administrative technician, eventually got myself to be a manager of administration. And I was with the health board for about 9 years until and during those 9 years, I spent 5 of those years living in the community of Mistissini, which was definitely an adventure. It was very eye-opening. I hadn't lived anywhere except for Brossard, so to live in a community was very interesting. I actually loved it. It was amazing, and I'm so thankful to have had that experience. But I ended up having my first child there, and I really wanted to be closer to my parents, so I had to find another job back in Montreal. And that's how I ended up switching over to the Cree Nation government, where I've been with the Cree Nation government now for since what was it, 2013? So another 9 years. There, I'm the manager of capital assets. So now it's been about 12 years in management roles. And then at this point, I was just thinking, like, you know, I'd really like to kind of test the waters again with school. Like, I had abandoned it for so long, but I wanted to complete something so that at least, you know, I can encourage my kids to go back to school or stay in school. So I was given the opportunity to do a program at McGill, Indigenous Business Management. So I did complete that. It was a very good experience. I was very scared to have like relapses of anxiety, but I think it really helped that my classmates were also my colleagues, and they were also Indigenous. So I had a more like comfortable environment to kind of reintegrate myself into education. And yeah, that's my journey.
Thank you. Maybe I'll carry on with what you're talking about, Rachel, regarding we're talking about, you know, your work-life balance, but also your family, and very naive questions will come out of me during these webinars because we don't know you, and you're talking to someone who's been in Canada for 7 years only. Something I've noticed is that Indigenous students are sometimes more mature, so they come back to studies later. Is it something that am I mistaken here, or is it something that is common among your communities to go back to school later and seek employment before, or build a family as before? Can you tell us a bit more about that, Donna?
Yes, I can, because I did it. Well, I don't know if I mentioned, I think I forgot to mention that I'm from the community, Waswanipi. It's one of the inland communities, because we have your coastal communities and you have your inland communities. Well, Waswanipi is one of them. And most natives have their families young. I have 7 children, so yeah, I had them young. And well, after once they were old enough, you know, to be in school, then I decided to do something that I always wanted to do.
And is it something common within your community, Donna?
It's very common.
And even you not living in your community, you have experienced that in the same way? Is that what you're telling us?
Yes. I don't know if Rachel has something to say about that too.
Rachel?
Yeah, so I found actually the same thing, that it happens a lot in the communities. A lot of people have their kids very young. It's not uncommon to have your kids, at least have one kid by 18 years old. So when that happens, you know, it's difficult to juggle being in school, having a kid, and then you're having to support that kid. So you need a job. And so something has to give. And a lot of times it's education. And it also doesn't help that I find in general, Indigenous parents, they don't value education the same way that maybe non-Indigenous parents do. Some of that could stem from, you know, residential schools and whatnot. So it's different. And there's also a lot of value placed on not so much schoolwork, but, you know, being out on the land and learning how to live that life, live a traditional life. So like for me, like I have a lot of family that learned how to go fishing and learn how to do hunting and all these other things. And that was the priority over education. So eventually a lot of us do find our ways back to education. It just, you know, takes a few detours.
Thank you. Émilie, est-ce que c'est quelque chose que tu as observé dans tes recherches? Is it something that you've observed over the years working with different communities regarding insertion? We're talking about insertion within education first, even before talking about insertion within employment.
Actually, yes. And there's a huge difference. I just wrote that 50% of the population, Indigenous population in Quebec and Canada, is below under the age of 30, which is it is a very young population. But also about what you're saying, we can see that there's a difference between two populations. It is important to say it and to distinct it, that the population that has been living in their communities for all their life, and on the other side, the population who is living in a urban in community urban, urban community. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm looking for my words. But yes, we can see, and it is almost obvious that a lot of people do their family before their studies. But we have also to understand that there's a philosophy, or it is the way they look at education is different. It means for me that they are going to think about learning all the life, okay, and not only for a few time. Let's say for us, we have a number of years to get a diploma, to get a degree. They don't. They can study and learn all their life. It's very philosophy in addition. Philosophy.
And Donna and Rachel, do you feel as students, as Indigenous students, and do correct me if there are words, terms that I don't use properly. It's a space for that as well. If ever we use the wrong terms, do feel free to tell us that it's not, that they are not the right ones. Donna and Rachel, did you find that from what Emily is saying and what you have said as well, that universities accommodate for this situation that is kind of general in your realities, but not necessarily in the realities of the rest of the Quebecois and Canadian students? How do you navigate around these differences when you get into education in post-secondary institutions? Donna?
I'm thinking about that one because I'm trying to remember what Emily, I'll let Rachel start talking about that because I'm not sure if I understood what Emily just said.
Well, how was your integration into education coming after forming your family? How did you feel, you know, if it wasn't a common thing among Quebecois and Canadian students, but it is in your communities? How was your integration in post-secondary education within the university, and what were the main elements of your experience within that?
Okay, what I really enjoy about the UQAT here in Val-d'Or is it is Indigenous. It is an Indigenous university, so it was easy for me to you know, feel comfortable and find my place because I was amongst, you know, I don't know if I should say this, but my people, you know, and we are very shy people, and you know, we do have a difficulty sometimes, you know, finding our way in. But you know, when you know, when there's other Indigenous people, it is more, you know, comfortable. I don't know if it's and the UQAT in Val-d'Or, what I really enjoy about it is they have a place, you know, with they kind of made a local for the Indigenous because there's not only Indigenous students there, you know, we are a section of the university, and you know, there's other sections, but we have a lounge, you know, for the native students. So you know, they go there, and it's their comfy spot.
But does this work? Does having a lounge for Indigenous students where they can come and do their own things, does this work?
I'll tell you what happened during the years, because I've been there for a while. You know, at the beginning, you know, when they created this lounge, I was there. So it worked. Yes, you know, the natives would go into this lounge and they were free to speak their language, you know, talk amongst them. You know, the culture was very alive in this lounge, okay? And, you know, spirituality and everything, you know, everything they wanted to practice was allowed, you know. It was like, I don't like using the word allowed, but anyways, you know, they were able to be free in this place. But during the years, what happened was, I don't know if, you know, slowly the non-natives kind of, you know, were invited into this, into this lounge. And it was okay, you know, it was okay. I didn't have a problem with that. And, but eventually, like what I saw was, you know, the natives were slowly coming out. The non-natives were coming into this lounge and the natives were coming out, until eventually it was a non-native lounge, you know? I mean, the natives weren't going there anymore. And I found that kind of sad, you know, that they didn't have their little comfortable spot anymore. And still, as of today, it's like that. So I don't know if they are planning on, you know, doing something about that, but I think it's important that they have that spot for them. You know, it's like to them, to us, I should say, but you know, mainly sometimes I'll talk because I've been living in Val-d'Or for a while. So, but I have a lot of friends, you know, that are up north and that come down and you know, I talk to them a lot too. So I know, you know, their realities coming from the community. And yeah, so I don't know. That's something that I'm planning on talking to the university about, to see what their plans are on this lounge.
Thanks, Donna. We have a hand raised here. Wasila, go on ahead. Thank you.
Donc, bonjour tout le monde. Merci à nos invités. Thank you to our guests. Je vais poser la question en français, puis je vais essayer de la traduire en anglais. C'est plus pour Émilie Deschênes. Donc, les études en matière de choix de carrière indiquent que les gens, donc, quand ils arrivent à faire des choix déjà de programmes universitaires ou de carrière, sont souvent influencés par le genre. Donc, on n'a qu'à penser au mur de verre là, qui sépare un certain nombre d'emplois qui sont typiquement féminins, d'autres qui sont masculins. Puis aussi, ces choix-là peuvent être influencés par le niveau d'éducation, par l'ethnicité. Mais là, est-ce que vous pensez que appartenir à la communauté autochtone ou au peuple de Première Nation ajoute une couche de complexité dans ces choix à la fois de programmes postsecondaires ou encore d'emploi? I try to say it in English. Studies about career choices indicate that career choices are influenced by gender, education level, ethnicity. Do you think that belonging to the First Nations communities adds some degree of complexity in this choice? Are First Nations members limited to choose a field of study or a type of job of industry? Thank you.
Merci, Wassia, pour ta question très pertinente. Je pense que je commencerai par encore une fois répéter que quand tu viens d'une communauté, c'est peut-être différent que quand tu as habité dans une grande ville toute ta vie. Et je pense que là où il y a une différence, puis il y a peut-être que Rachel ou Donna pourront en parler aussi, mais le choix va être différent quand tu arrives d'une communauté et on tend, en tout cas dans la recherche, dans ce qu'on fait, dans ce qu'on regarde et dans ce qu'on constate, on voit que les étudiants vont choisir des métiers qui vont leur permettre de retourner dans leur communauté et de redonner. Et ça, c'est intéressant parce que ça ramène à l'idée du capital social et de la communauté qui entoure les étudiants, qui est fondamentale pour la majorité des gens là, qui arrivent de communautés autochtones. Ouais, très pertinent. Sinon, c'est sûr que ça peut jouer dans le sens où on a des communautés dans lesquelles c'est pas tous les métiers qui sont représentés. Donc, peut-être que le choix va être influencé par ça aussi. Mais je pense que c'est plus une façon de vivre que liée à l'ethnicité ou au fait d'être autochtone.
So I'll try to summarize what Emily's just said. Wasila's question was about the career choices of Indigenous students, but if it had an impact on the choices of education as well. And Emily was saying that it's got to do with the fact that Indigenous students sometimes choose some career paths or some education programs in relation to what they can contribute to their communities when they return to their communities, if they're choosing to go back to their communities to work. That means that there's a big difference between people living in cities and those living closer to their communities. And what the challenge that Emily is pointing at as well is regarding the fact that not all the professions or the trades are represented or are present in the community. So sometimes choosing the education program might be an issue because you don't know afterwards what you're going to work on if that's not represented within your community, but you had planned to go back, to return, and to give back in a certain way to the community itself. That brings me to Rachel. Thanks for the question, Wasila, because Rachel lived in a city and Rachel has a different experience from Donna. So this is really interesting. Donna was giving us an account of how it was maybe easier to integrate within UQAT, given the proximity with the communities, geographical one. But Rachel, you having been in a Montreal University and living in Montreal, could you say that your experience has been similar to Donna? If yes or no, why?
Actually, for myself, I thought it was kind of difficult, and I didn't think it would be because, like, I I'm a self-professed city girl. But what I did learn was, like, especially my classroom experience, I find in the classroom, there's like sort of a standard way of like managing your classroom. If you have a question, you're expected to raise your hand and ask. The problem is, I think the vast majority of Indigenous people are introverted. They're not going to put their hands up. They're not going to ask. So what happens is they don't know that one piece of, you know, the puzzle that they really needed. And come test time, well, they're not going to do so good. And I see this happening a lot. And as an introvert, I also struggled with that, because I'm like, well, do I want a good grade, or am I going to ask that question? And a lot of people will not find the confidence to ask. And so the way that classroom is managed, I find it's a hindrance to a lot of First Nation people who are just not going to put themselves out there to find out what they don't know. Also, I saw that there's, you know, most learning is done through textbooks, which again doesn't quite align with the way that the Indigenous culture is. You know, we're definitely all about storytelling. That's how we learn. That's how information has been passed on for forever. And so there's also that extra adjustment that you have to make. Time management was also a huge thing, because, you know, like, even though I haven't been living in the communities my whole life, I've been working for Indigenous organizations for most of my life. And the culture there is really about taking your time, you know, don't rush, you know, where are you rushing to? And that is not at all compatible with student life, where you're expected to, you know, have all these deadlines, projects to do, have time to study and whatever. So there's that extra, you know, thing that you have to also work on. None of it are hurdles that you cannot clear. It's just, you know, an extra added effort on your part to be able to succeed.
Rachel, I hear you say the word extra a lot, and
yes,
and it's good. I mean, it's good. I mean, it rings a bell. It shows that, you know, there are already challenges facing students, and students also trying to find work-study balance. But what I hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that sometimes as an Indigenous student, you have extra effort to do both, to adapt to the classroom reality itself, to the university reality, and then to your environment within which you try to find employment. Is that what you're telling us?
That was my experience. You know, it was my experience and a lot of my colleagues' experiences. It was, and I think that also made the whole educational experience to be a little bit more daunting, because, you know, it's not just the coursework you're worrying about. It's also all of these added things.
Émilie, est-ce que je pourrais te demander si tu as observé justement, ou tu as entendu des étudiants t'en parler aussi? Have any students witnessed or told you about these experiences that Donna and Rachel are?
What I heard from Rachel, and thank you for sharing, we can hear it a lot. Okay, we have many adaptations to make, but sometimes institutions, they think that the students have to adapt, not themselves. And this is where we go with decolonization, and when we are trying to decolonize the courses, the programs. Let's say the program in which Donna is studying is a special program for Indigenous communities. They're doing their bachelor in a very long time. They can take only 1 class or 2 classes a year. So this is an adaptation. But what she's also saying is that the students always adapt to those realities, always. And it's not only a question of culture. Yes, it is a question of culture, because they are in an environment where there's no cultural benchmarks. Okay, there's nothing that they can recognize themselves. Let's say the structure that Donna was talking about at the École des autochtones de UQAT, it is at some point, something that we tried. to implement, for them to feel to sense the sense of belonging with the school. But then they also have to adapt to the language. Okay, sometimes it's not their mother tongue, and it is even sometimes their third language. Okay, they have to learn French, they have to learn English, and this is a huge step difficult also for to adapt. And what you said also, Rachel, was very interesting about the institution, the complexity of the institution. When you come from a 3,000 persons village community, believe me, institution is very huge, and it is difficult for administrative staff to understand how it works. And then you are lost in a huge institution where it's not your language, not your culture, and you don't see anybody who looks like you. So this is an adaptation very hard to make. So yes, we hear it more and more. Rachel, thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Quick question to Rachel. Were you surrounded by many other Indigenous students in the programs that you studied in Montreal?
Yeah, so like for most of my program, for most of my courses, it was mostly just with Indigenous students. But I did have some courses where I was the only Indigenous student. So I have both of those experiences, and I could definitely tell you right now, it felt very different. Being in those two environments, you could feel the difference. And I was way more comfortable being with the Indigenous students because at least I felt I could ask questions, I could, look stupid or whatever, and I won't feel bad about myself. But I did not have that same confidence when I was the only Indigenous student.
Thanks for that. And maybe I'll transit on to, work experience. Donna, you were telling me you were coming out of your practicum today to come to this webinar. So you are also working, like having teaching practice because you're studying in primary education teaching. What happens when you are at work then? I know that you are mostly in an environment where you have people of your community or Indigenous people around you. But for instance, in your workplace at the moment where you have practice, is the teacher an Indigenous person as well? And what does this imply for you? What happens at work?
Well, Val-d'Or is, there's a lot of Indigenous people, and especially our English school, because the Cree population and the Algonquin the Algonquin population, most of them are French, but the Cree population, they're English, and they go to Golden Valley. But the teachers are non-native that work there, but they have a lot of experience with the native.
Have you experienced any cultural differences and issues really, in the way you would do things? You're working in education, so there is a heavy cultural burden regarding, the work that you do per se itself. So have you experienced, do you have any anecdotes or anything where, you would have faced a clash in the way you do things and the way other people around you do things?
Yes, the discipline. Well, I'm in a kindergarten group, okay? So they're small, and my trainee teacher is very, very, orderly and structured. And, I just try to keep up with her most of the time because she's doing one thing and going off to, and I'm like, I'd play a little more with the kids, or I do, I'd finish their activity, but it's like, oh no, it's the next activity. So yeah, I was, but I have to adapt to that because I would like to work at this school perhaps after. So yeah, they're kind of, it's different. It's very different. And I asked her also, because she has centers, okay, in her classroom. And I was wondering if she ever had a cultural area for the students, because like in her class right now, I think there's 5 out of 17 students that are native just in her classroom. So And she said, no, she has never really thought of it, but she doesn't, but she gave me the, she told me if I wanted to implement, a center, and that's what I'm working on, because I'm very, with culture, I'm very connected. So I love talking about things like that. And when I had my daycare, it was the same thing. I had my, it was very cultural. It was so yeah. Where was I going with this?
So you were trying to take in some initiatives to create some space, some areas where, people could interact in a certain way. This is what I hear from what you're saying.
Yes.
And thanks, Donna. And Rachel, you living in Montreal, has there been any barriers that you felt when you started employment, or are there, the ones that you were talking about within universities? Are they also present in workplaces that you may have been in within Montreal?
Yes, in some ways, yes, because like I mentioned earlier, I had worked for some Indigenous organizations, but I also worked for some non-Indigenous companies. And I found the cultures super different between the two. For instance, at least in the non-Indigenous companies, I know that there's a requirement for like educational requirements that they're very strict about. And unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of Indigenous people, they might be educated, but it might come later in life, or it's a nonlinear path. So they might not have that requirement out of the gate, or maybe if ever. And the problem with that is like there are a lot of people that have a lot to offer, but are not given that chance. And that's a huge barrier to overcome. Also, there are different values. I know like for when I am working for the Cree Nation government, we have things like Goose Break, which is like 1 week to go practice your culture in the Cree world. It means going goose hunting. And that's really big. Like even for school, they take time off from school, 1 week or 2 weeks off for school just to go take your kids, go goose hunting. And you're not going to find that in non-Indigenous companies. There's no cultural week or anything like that. Also for like, I was talking to my sister about it, that in a lot of Indigenous families live multi-generationally. Like there are your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, everyone is all under one roof. Up north, a lot of times that's due to lack of housing, but it even happens in the cities. And I think it's sort of part of the culture. And one of the things that comes out of that, though, is that a lot of policies in non-Indigenous companies don't allow for like a very great amount of time for like bereavement leave or anything, like if you lose an aunt, but maybe that aunt was really kind of your mother or your sister because you grew up with them like that. Like for instance, I grew up with my niece. She's like my sister. We were together our whole lives. And I won't be valued that same way in a non-Indigenous organization. Like I'll just be sort of an aunt, but really I'm like her sister. So there are those kind of differences as well.
And Donna, I think it relates to you as well. Would you mind saying, like, you were talking about your grand aunt earlier, so you lived with your grand aunt and before moving outside of the community. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And my other question would be, would you have gone back to work within the community?
Okay, well, yes, I was raised by my great aunt. Mm-hmm. My mom was around, but I was raised by my great aunt, who was Native, spoke her language, was very traditional, and yeah. But no, like I mentioned, we never. It was her idea not to go live on a reserve. My aunt worked for equality. My great aunt, she was a translator for in court for the Native people. So she translate the language from Cree to English or Cree to French. She was very involved in inequality, believe it or not. And she was a very amazing woman. I mean, a lot of people know her today. And she's in some research books that was done by many researchers. I forget the name of the books, but she's in at least 2 or 3 of them for her involvement in her community and her people. But no, I mean, like she mentioned, I like what Rachel mentioned, because it is very true what she just said. You know, my mother was raised by her, my aunt raised her 2 brothers' children. So they all were together and they were all considered as sisters and brothers, but they weren't, they were cousins. And as for myself too, when I was raised by my great aunt, there was other children there. You know, we were all, I mean, it's family, you know, even if you're not, you know.
You big family, but it's family. It's fully family.
Yeah.
And does that make you want to go back to work in your community, Donna?
Well, like I said, I never really worked on my community.
But given that proximity, do you feel
that is one of my what I wanted? Well, you have to know the area here, okay? We're not it's not Montreal or Quebec. I mean, it's not a big, you know, like Val d'Or. Saint-Terre is, I think, a population of 3,000-4,000, you know, people. So, you know, you have a bunch of these little cities, little towns, and you have little communities. And there's Lac-Simon and there's Picogan that I went to go visit, and they're on their communities, their native communities, French. But I really enjoyed visiting their school, and I really one day would love to, you know, work on either one of these communities.
Thank you. Thanks. We have a question from Wassila, but if you don't mind, Wassila, je vais juste laisser Émilie intervenir et je prends ta question après.
No, but I would, and I'm sorry, Donna, but I'd like to know, and you may feel free not to say or to answer, but would you raise all your children in a Indigenous community now?
If I would raise my children on a Native community?
And put them in the school on a Native community, if we are talking about the educational system that you know well, because you...
Yes, I do. I mean, I was part of, okay, when I was younger, I had my kids younger, my first kids younger, so I went back to school, and I had a problem, like I'm living like in between, you know, the Native, because I am, you know, half Native and half American, so I live some discrimination on both sides. And the Cree School Board wanted me to go to my community because the course was given on my community. But I told them, I said, I've never lived on my community. I said, I've always lived on the outside. I said, why can't I just go to the school, you know, in town? And I had to really, you know, argue my point until they decided to, they agreed with me, because on the community, I mean, we're not going to hide it, you know, the education is a couple of years, you know, lower than the education in town. So I told them, if you send me there, I'm already finished my high school. So that was like a point I had to, you know, really prove, and I did. And so they let me finish my high school in town at that point.
This is
so if you're telling me, would I send my kids? No, I don't. No, I wouldn't. No, they're okay here.
It's interesting. First of all, for what you're saying. Secondly, you're talking about how the institutions or the institutional context didn't take into consideration that your case, for instance, Donna, that you didn't have to go back to the community to receive your education, having been raised outside. But for the institutional context, you were put you were a part of the statistics, so you were kind of added to, and it was logical in this logic. You were meant to go and get education there. I find that really interesting. Maybe Émilie, est-ce que tu as des exemples? Excuse me, Donna, go on ahead.
Okay, I just want to add something there, because I guess, you know, reserves, maybe I'm a little older than Rachel is, so I lived a couple of incidents, but, you know, like my aunt, like I told you, she did not want to, she did not want, she fought to stay in town because she thought it was so bad to send natives in a little area, you know. So maybe that's a part of my reason why I don't want to go back, you know, because I've never, I mean, natives should be free. They shouldn't be put on pieces, you know. There you go.
Yeah. Merci, Donna. Émilie, tu voulais rajouter quelque chose?
Oui, très rapidement, je voudrais faire un point d'information par rapport à ce que Donna dit, parce qu'on dit souvent, bon, qu'il y a un gap, educational gap between the non-native and the native students. But actually, yes, but this is under the perspective or majority or society that is majoritaire. That is to say that if we could see the situation with another perspective, we would understand that those students, they are actually, it's not a question of level. On ne peut pas hiérarchiser, parce qu'en réalité, ces enfants-là ne sont pas en retard, sont en retard par rapport à la norme qu'on s'impose comme société majoritaire, ce qui est très différent. Et la majorité du temps, quand ils arrivent et qu'ils sont un peu, si on essaie de les intégrer dans le système québécois, okay, puis encore une fois, il n'est pas mieux, il n'est pas pire, mais c'est de se dire qu'il faut comprendre que ces élèves-là, souvent, ont fait leur langue maternelle jusqu'en 3e année primaire. Okay, so they arrive in 4th grade with no knowledge of English or French. And then they have to do mathematics, science, languages, everything in a new language. So of course, naturally, when they are finishing their primary studies, of course, they are not at the same level. And this is a word I don't like to use, but they are not at the same place. But it's not because they are far from the others. They are not, ils sont pas plus loin, ils sont pas derrière nous. Ils sont juste à côté en train de suivre un chemin qui est différent. Je voulais préciser.
Yes, you're right about that. I just didn't. It's because they wanted me to finish my secondary 5 there, okay. And what you explained about, you know, the language being up, you know, going to grade 4. That is true. I mean, they.
So it's the diversity of learning curves and learning paths that are not taken into consideration, trying to mix one with the other or assimilate one to the other. With as you say, Émilie, there's a hierarchy in saying one is better than the other, which is problematic within our systems, rather than and acknowledging the diversity, the differences in approaches or in paths.
Yes, and that would feed prejudice and racism, because they will arrive and people will say, oh, they're not able to, they're not capable, they don't do it the right way. Okay, but
the one best way.
Yes, but this is huge in our society, and this is something that schools have been instrumentalized, have been used to push it in our heads, all of us. While you were having the pensionnat, okay, all the kids and the jeunesse culturelle and everything we know today, at the same time, schools were used for us to remind us all Indigenous people were bad, as white, we should not talk to them, and so on. And, you know, everybody from my generation or even older, we don't know anything about the Indigenous. It is not a part of our learning in school. And this is very, very, very bad. We were talking about the colonization of institutions. We are talking about the programs, but also the classes, the courses. And this is something that you may want to talk about, Rachel and Donna, because, you know, it's not easy. For example, you are studying in to be a teacher, okay? But university is not capable right now to know exactly how it is in an Indigenous communities. So we are trying to teach you something that is, on our perspective, the good thing to teach, but at the same time, it is not similar enough of what you are experiencing in your community. So at this point, you see that there's a wall between institution and the communities. And this is where also we are facing this problem. You mentioned it, Donna, but there's no Indigenous teachers in the normal, the Québécois system. So how could we value, how could we promote, how could we include Indigenous perspectives in the curriculums and the courses in this institution, just the way we're doing things, just the way we are thinking of it, of education, of success, of learning. And this is what you were talking, Rachel, about adapting yourself. The students always have to adapt to everything. So this is one of the difficulty they're facing, definitely.
Thanks. I'm looking at the time. I'll just, do you have a quick question, Wasila? And then I'll go on to we wanted to talk about the employment relations and unions to finish. Thank you. Wasila?
A quick question for Rachel or Donna. How do you live this nice difference, your belonging to the communities of First Nations in the workplace? Are you happy in the workplace when the majority of workers and the employers are different? Thank you.
I'll let Rachel answer that because I've always worked with Native people.
Yeah.
So she has more of a...
Yeah, well, for me personally, I mean, I'm able to get along well with most people. So whether it was everyone was Indigenous or nobody was Indigenous, in that sense, I was comfortable enough to be around anybody. So I was okay in both environments.
Does it help, you think, Rachel, is because you were raised in a city yourself?
Yeah, I think it definitely helped because, I mean, throughout most of my schooling, elementary, high school, I was the only Indigenous person in my classroom. So you kind of get used to being around non-Indigenous people and it's fine. So I'm totally okay with diversity.
Thanks very much. It's a good transition, actually, this question to what we wanted to talk about, because my next sort of thought was, what happens when you're in the workplace and some workplaces are unionized? And if you've heard anything about what Indigenous people from the Indigenous population think about unions, and also what do unions do enough or not to accommodate these cultural differences? So I'll ask the question to Rachel and Donna if you've had any experiences about that, and then I'll hand the stage to Émilie if you have observed anything regarding how unions are perceived. And this relates to Kai's question a little bit within the chat.
I could start.
Yes.
Actually, when I did my 9 years at the Cree Health Board is unionized. And the Cree Nation government where I am right now is non-unionized. So I did have those two experiences. In a lot of ways, the unionized environment is actually beneficial to Indigenous people because like I spoke about earlier, the whole introversion thing, you're a lot better protected, I find, when there are union rules. Whereas it's very easy to just kind of be sort of walked over when you're in a non-unionized environment. Sometimes I kind of feel like the place where I'm working right now, I mean, it sort of has like a reputation of sort of being like the Wild Wild West, where anything goes basically. And sometimes rules are being made and you don't really understand, you know, why they're being made or why is it applied differently with different people. And you don't really have all of that ambiguity in a unionized environment. So I did appreciate that when I was at the health board. But there are pros and cons for both. So
And were there any initiatives in regard to the Indigenous population within the place which was unionized, Rachel?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Was there anything to create awareness? You know, like how now unions are creating awareness about equity, and we're talking about these, unpacked words like inclusion. Have you ever encountered initiatives within your workplaces in regard to the Indigenous population, for instance, or other minority groups?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. And Donna, have you experienced anything regarding unions within your workplace?
Sorry, I had a hard time putting on the speaker. No, not really. I mean, I haven't. No, so it doesn't really apply to me.
That's all right. Emily, have you observed anything in regard to what Rachel is saying, and maybe if you've seen anything?
Yes. Thank you for that, Rachel. What I found is that there's a paradox, there's a contradiction also between that, because unions are a system to ensure that norms are respected. But what do we do when those norms are not the same for the union and for my working environment as an Indigenous in a community? And this might not, it has to be very well placed and adapt and talked and communicate and explain. But the union is not negative for me and for Indigenous communities, because for me it is also a way of being in a network. We were talking about the social capital. It is also cultural capital. It is also, for me, a community capital. And this kind of network can help also when we are not in our community, to get people to have around us people that can help. But definitely, if it is well explained, it is, and if this union does not duplicate like colonial dynamics, it is, for me, it might be a good thing.
Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions if we have any from the audience, and then we'll wrap up if you have anything else. Anybody for a question? Nadia?
I was going to raise my hand, but
I saw you.
I'm physically, I show things.
Thanks for being here.
There's something that really caught my attention on what Donna spoke about. I know that there's some programs in the Indigenous studies at UQAT. And I was wondering, when Donna spoke about this lounge made for Indigenous people, are there non-Indigenous students that go into studies in the context of Indigenous living? For example, I study in career development, and I've looked into those programs because I'm curious to work with Indigenous people, but I sort of had that question where is it just Indigenous students, or is it kind of open to everybody?
I'll answer that question, because I had a friend, a non-native friend, that wanted to join because she was interested in one of our programs, and it had to do with Indigenous studies, and she was denied. And I asked the university, and I never really got an answer to that question, and I never went further. So I don't know why they don't. I guess it's where the funding, I don't know. I can't really.
But I think you're both touching an interesting point here. Maybe I'll let Emily go on about that, because
there's something about that also. It's the language regulation. Actually, UQAT is a French university, and French students should study in French universities in the public system. But also we have to understand that those cohorts, those groups of Indigenous and at UQAT are taught in English. So this is the thing also. So it is one part of the answer, but it's not all.
It's not all of it, because my friend was English and went to English school. So it has to do with something else.
But I mean, part of my question was, because I believe it's important to keep those spaces safe. You know, like Donna, you explained the phenomenon that happened, that space was created, and when non-Indigenous people started coming around, it kind of drew out. And so I was wondering, you know, a part of our education, if we're to create programs that are specifically made for Indigenous people, what's the perception of non-Indigenous people entering those spaces?
Very quickly, I could answer that Indigenous thinking of education is very, very inclusive. And for me, there's no point of saying, no, you're not Indigenous, you're not going in that group, because it's a question of being all together and learning from each other. Learning and is seen as a community of persons who are teaching and learning at the same time, all complementary. They all have some sets of skills, and it's not the same. And even the teacher or the professor should be at the same. You know, I'm pretty sure that the students have to teach things to professors as well. But for me, it's
I think you're touching on something really crucial within, you know, everything we've been talking about. Émilie, you were mentioning the norms, be it, you know, the Canadian or Quebecois norms, or the Indigenous communities norms that don't necessarily meet each other halfway all the time. And it feels like, you know, the openness on both sides is problematic. It's difficult. We want to open, but we don't want to. Like, we want to mix, but we don't want. We can't mix, for institutional reasons, for linguistic reasons, or for cultural reasons, or for personal reasons. So I think we're touching on the, you know, the nerve that is actually causing all the challenges we've been mentioning here for an hour regarding the inclusion that we're trying to, we would like to see, the natural inclusion we'd like to see. We shouldn't even have to talk about inclusion. What do you think?
I think that history is a huge reason why we have mistrust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in Quebec. And based on this history, I would be very mistrusting those persons that have been here to colonize. And a funny fact about that, if you go on Google and you type who has founded Canada, guess what you're gonna find. Okay, you're going to find Jean Cabot, Jacques Cartier. This is what you're going to find on Google. So the history is a huge part of the answer. But right now, and as we said, we don't know this history in Quebec. Okay, it is not taught, so we don't know. And how can we understand? How can we be empathic? How can we help if we don't know the needs, if we don't know the challenges, if we don't know the realities? So it's very, very difficult. And I think this seminar, this webinar today would help with that.
It's very, very, I mean, I'm really grateful for you, for all of you being here and your questions and comments, because the idea is actually to go back, you know, to go backwards, because we are trying to solve issues within our universities by adding new norms, accès à l'emploi pour les professeurs, or more access for students to some courses. I mean, that's what's happening in various universities in Quebec and Canada. And in a similar vein, we're trying to promote equity within unions and having new politics within our collective agreements, etc. But the base is still, we're trying to touch the base now, because it's the foundation that has to be addressed, and which have caused the norms that we have now that are not necessarily working for everyone. So if you don't have any questions, I'd like to thank you very much for your presence, for your histories and stories and narratives, for your testimonies, for your experiences. And unless you want to add something at the end, Donna?
Yeah, I want to add something. Anyways, it was mentioned a little earlier.
Go ahead.
And you know what I think a lot of people don't realize is that residential school isn't very far. You know, and my great aunt, my mom lived it. So, you know, it's like, and they expect the next generation to just, you know, but that's not the way it works. So, yeah.
Thank you, Donna, for having that. Emily?
How can we
It's
talk
the confidence that is hard to get back.
Yes, and we cannot work on something that doesn't have the same semantic, the same signification. If we're talking about education, and that education is not meaning the same thing for both of us, how can we find a compromise? If we continue to think that education is only one thing, if we continue to think that success is only one thing, that perseverance is only one thing, we have to share also what the words are means. With regards to what Donna said.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to add something?
No. I know we were talking about what was the last creating a more inclusive space, and I was thinking like I would like to see like displaying Indigenous contributions to society. I don't really see that a lot anywhere. I had mentioned that also to Miguel, because I know my father, he's always talking about, you know, the Mi'kmaq have invented this and that and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, you know, most people don't know these things, but it should be out there. It should be something visual that people see. And so that's something I'd like to definitely see more of.
History stories, putting them out, making them more visible, I guess. Will be something that will stay with me actually for this webinar. I'm really grateful for all your generosity today and everything that we've shared. And I'll thank you very much. I'll close this webinar now. Thanking you very much, Émilie Deschênes, Donna Sanford, and Rachel Martin for being with us and for being so generous. And thanks for your questions, Nadia and Wasila. And I hope we will be able to have more space like that to discuss these things and create that inclusive space that Rachel is talking about and I'd like to see, but for real, not just trying to navigate around the existing norms and not shaking them. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. I thank you all. Thanks for being here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.